Breakthrough.
You're watching Breakthrough News.
You are indeed watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side Live. I'm one of your hosts, Eugene Puryear, here as always, alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, good to be back with you.
Good to be back on with you, Eugene.
It's always, well, the pleasure's all mine. Let's just say that.
I'll let you have it. I'm not going to argue.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. Sorry, everybody. We started a little bit late here, but we've got a great show for you as always. So if you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to hit subscribe. Also hit the bell so you can get the alerts for all of our content here on Breakthrough News, including dispatches with Rania Khalek. You also should take the time to tell everyone you can, whoever's following you, to follow us, because we are on, we're live. We got all sorts of things here today. Obviously, we are just about tomorrow 1 year away from the anniversary of the Russia-Ukraine war, so we've got a lot to say about all of that. We're going to be talking about tensions on the Korean Peninsula, the mayoral election in Chicago, which is next Tuesday, third largest city in America, and also we are going to be discussing the Taiwan connection coming out of, the continued new Cold War, as it were. So, Rania, anything else people need to know?
Yeah, they need to know that we are at the end of our campaign to get 50 patrons in the month of February so that Eugene joins Instagram. That's the win. If we can get 50 patrons, we're almost there. So if you've not yet signed up, you can become a patron of Breakthrough News at patreon.com/Breakthrough News. And this will go towards getting Eugene on Instagram. But more importantly, obviously, it goes towards helping to support and grow our content here at Breakthrough News, all of our, what I think is incredible journalism, bringing you independent media that you're not getting other places. So become a patron, you guys. And you can also, of course, donate on YouTube if you'd prefer to make a one-time donation.
Yes, just below this screen, you certainly can donate on YouTube. And as it says right there at the bottom, patreon.com/Breakthrough News, patreon.com/Breakthrough News. Go ahead and hit subscribe, hit the bell so that you can get the alerts. I want to just jump right into it, Rania. I'm just trying to make sure we have our first guest here or not. Don't want to introduce someone who's not actually there. Apologies, since we're starting a little late. It looks like the person is there. We can go ahead and do it. We want to turn our attention to the Korean Peninsula, where tensions are rising in the context of, well, many different things that we're going to get into here. And we are very, very honored to be joined by Joo-hyun Park, who's a member of Notatol and the engagement editor at The Real News. Joo-hyun, thank you so much for being with us here on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Eugene and Rania. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Well, it's really a pleasure to have you with us. And I guess I hate to even use the phrase tensions are rising. It sounds so mainstream. But obviously there is a number of stories that are coming out, AP News today, a number of others, saying that North Korea is, launching all of these nuclear missiles, preparing for war, every bad thing you could possibly imagine. And, all of us should be very concerned here in the West because they're aimed at us. I suspect there's a lot of propaganda behind a lot of how that's presented. But just give us a sense of where we are in terms of the current state of the nuclear conflict and maybe some of what, we don't get in the mainstream media about what's actually happening on the peninsula. Oh, are we frozen? Oh.
Hi, I'm so sorry.
Oh, I think you might be breaking up. Oh, we have you? Okay. Can you hear us now?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Sure can. First question,
great.
To just quickly summarize it more or less, is in the context of quote-unquote rising tensions in the Korean Peninsula. I mean, what do we really know about, the so-called intentions of North Korea, which are allegedly warlike and terrible as opposed to the U.S., South Korea, and Japan, who are just trying to defend the world?
Right. So I think the first place to start is that the presentation of the question, as you phrase it, which is not your phrasing, but rather the corporate media's phrasing, is completely backwards. They present if the US and South Korea and Japan are acting in a defensive manner, while the DPRK or North Korea is acting in an aggressive manner, but it's actually inverted. And I think looking at the specific situation that's played out over the last week can help us a lot in understanding more. So last week, the United States and South Korea announced that they would hold new war drills over the next month. The big reveal was a Freedom Shield war game that will take place in Korea this March. And the other announcement, South Korean defense officials would visit DC for a simulation on deploying US nukes to Korea. That's actually happening right now, I believe. So on February 18th, the US and Japan had a separate war drill on their own called Iron Fist. They practiced an amphibious landing together. In other words, they practiced using naval forces to invade an unspecified territory. So that same day, the DPRK or North Korea responded with an ICBM test. The US, South Korea, and Japan launched their warplanes in a show of force in response, and then North Korea fired two more short range missiles over the East Sea. This is a dynamic that we saw play out all throughout last year when there was a lot of hullabaloo in the media about the number of missiles that the DPRK was firing. But what they weren't focusing on was that it was also a year where there were a lot of military drills between the US and South Korea that are specifically aimed at being provocative towards the North and specifically aimed at practicing invading the North. So these war drills, as I mentioned, are really destabilizing the situation in the region generally. And then whenever the DPRK responds to a show of force, suddenly corporate media arrives to tell us that Kim Jong-un is having another tantrum and that's all that's going on. What's really happening is that we're really in the midst of a very sharp escalation of US-led militarization in Northeast Asia. And it's only going to get worse because the US and South Korea already promised that they will do even more war drills this year than last year.
Oh, Rania, we can't hear you. You're muted.
I was muted. Thank you. Wow, today is one of those days. It's just let me try that again. But no, to get to build on what you were saying. I mean, what's the reason for this now? Why now? Is this just the sort of ebbs and flows of the U.S. ongoing warfare against North Korea, which of course has never ended? If this is always up and down every few months or every year, there'll be a period of time where we hear, oh, North Korea is acting aggressively. And of course, there's always much more to the story than that. Or is there something more behind this? Does this have anything to do with being a part of the US's escalation in the Cold War on China? Could you, what's actually behind this particular US provocation now?
That's a great question, Ron. And I think you're right on the money in identifying that it's just about what's going on in Korea. The Korean War is unfinished, it is ongoing, but that's been the case for a very long time. I think that what we're seeing right now is that there are some very important global epochal, I don't know how to pronounce that word, but there's big changes happening all around the world right now, and they're also affecting Korea. One of the big shifts is the shift towards multipolarity, which I know you've covered a lot in your programming and on the Breakthrough News Network in general. Right now, we're in a situation where the U.S. sanctions regime against North Korea and many countries in the world is starting to crack because of the blowback from sanctions on Russia. This is leading to alternate paths of trade between nations that didn't previously exist under the domination of the US dollar. And there are new openings that are probably going to only increase over the years, which will mean that the DPRK will have more options to round sanctions, to attend to its own development through closer alliances with other regional powers. And I think, as you mentioned, the Cold War with China has to do with what's happening right now as well. We all witnessed this balloon gate hullabaloo over the last couple of weeks where the US was just shooting everything out of the sky that it could, set its sights on. And I think that's really indicative of where we are right now in terms of trans-Pacific relations. Korea is a really key ingredient in the relations between US and China because Korea is really the main battleground that we've seen so far where this war has been fought over decades. Korea is the only where the Chinese and the US militaries have ever faced each other in battle. And it's also one of the main flashpoints in the region that could lead to a future war. Not to mention the fact that South Korea is also home to many of the US's military bases. It's the forwardmost position that the US has in the Pacific. And so really the intense militarization of Korea is something that was not really the case in past eras, but is so now. And a lot of that has to do with grander US imperial strategy in Asia and the significance that Korea has to that.
One of the things that I feel is also so misunderstood is, and maybe baked into the first couple of things we talked about, is the idea that in the DPRK they'll never negotiate. But of course, we know there've been multiple rounds of negotiations under multiple U.S. presidents. But now the way it's presented is, oh, well, the Biden administration is outreaching to them and they're unwilling to respond. But it seems like the context of what's happened in past negotiations, probably is impacting, what they'd like to see as first steps. So I was just hoping you could talk a little bit more about that, because it's this idea that, there's no way you can talk to the DPRK, I feel is a big thing that a lot of people in America seem to have, imbibed.
Thank you, Eugene. That's completely ahistorical angle that is just taken as mainstream fact in the United States. The DPRK has been trying to negotiate with the United States since at least the 1970s, arguably since the Korean War itself. The DPRK as a nation recognized that, particularly since the fall of the Soviet Union, that there is now only one world capitalist market, and that its development depends on its ability to be able to participate in a controlled manner in that market. And so since the 90s, the DPRK has made a lot of attempts to establish joint ventures with the country, to normalize relations with the West, particularly with the United States. And a lot of these efforts have been rebuffed or have simply gone nowhere. In the 1990s, there was an agreed framework whereby the DPRK would bring in safer technologies for its nuclear energy program in exchange for a process of normalization. That process never moved forward. And so the DPRK ended up on the path where it is now, where efforts on both sides of the peninsula to finally achieve an end to the Korean War, finally move forward the process of reunification in a bilateral way. And it was really the DPRK that extended the olive branch to the United States, not the other way around. And a lot of the initial promises that were made in the first were ultimately not upheld. And the second meeting that was held in Hanoi ultimately led nowhere, partially because the Trump administration really came in with a bad deal. The most important thing for the DPRK is achieving a security understanding with the U.S., also reducing sanctions that have been imposed on it by the U.S. and through the UN Security Council. Those are complete non-starters for the U.S. based under the Trump administration. Biden administration is upholding that line. So when officials come out and say, oh, we're trying to talk, but they won't talk to us, that's a really skewed narrative. What's really going on is that the Biden administration is not offering anything new. They're not really giving a reason for the DPRK to come to the negotiating table when they've been burned before, which means that the only option is to continue with this brinksmanship, continue demonstrating their own force and their ability to themselves until the U.S. to have a more mature conversation.
You mentioned the issue of sanctions. And I mean, North Korea is probably one of the most, if not the most sanctioned country in the world, especially given that the UN is also involved in executing sanctions, which, I don't think is common around the world, at least not since Iraq was under UN sanction. So, to that end, you mentioned the issue of multipolarity. And yes, we do talk a lot about that on our programming here. And I'm just curious, as we enter into this new multipolar era that we're kind of beginning to be in now, how might that be beneficial for peace in Korea?
I think beneficial in the sense that it will open up avenues for other actors in the region to also be involved. It can be beneficial in the sense that South Korea, too, is at a little bit of an inflection point. They're in a position where their bourgeoisie is very dependent on the US. At the same time, all the best opportunities for continued growth are not in the States, they're in Asia. And so South Korea is also from that question of integrate new rising order. At the same time, I do think that there are some parallels. The important one through Japan. I mentioned earlier that Japan was involved in war drills that ultimately provoked this fatal round of missile firing. Important thing to note is that Japan has been given the green light to rebuild its military. This is something in Europe too, right, with Germany. And I think it's a sign of where the US is in terms of its hegemonic cycle, that it now has to turn to these allies and say, you know, you need to start beefing up some of your own military capabilities in order to help us keep this thing that we have going here. And so I think Japan is also going to play an important role in wanting to continue the division, of wanting to maintain the status quo. And we're seeing that now with the pressure that South Korea is under to enter a formal military alliance with Japan, which it has never had, and which, you know, would be widely opposed by many Korean people, given Japan's colonial history in Korea and its unwillingness to offer reparations or even a real apology to the Korean people. So those are all some of the different sorts of factors that may come into play. And yet another, as I mentioned before, is that the DPRK itself, or North Korea, may have more opportunities for development than it did in the past. And in the next few years, it's quite possible that we'll see a stronger North Korea than one that we've seen at least in the last couple of decades.
Mm-hmm. Well, Joo Hyun, before we let you go, this is obviously an issue where it's hard for people to find good information. Can you give some recommendations for people who want to follow this about where they can find out more about what's happening as it concerns both the conflict and the DPRK itself?
Well, I would highly recommend following Norutdol. That's Nodutdol. You can find us on Instagram. You can find us on Twitter. Often we'll put out posts about Korean history. We'll comment about ongoing events. We'll share resources and host events that are educational. So I think that's a great place to start. Otherwise, you know, there's a large variety of different resources that one can access. I think a good place to start for folks totally unfamiliar is maybe the Blowback podcast. And there's also works by historians like Bruce Cummings and others, Stephen Gowans, who can be helpful in terms of getting a really basic understanding of the history of the peninsula.
Mm-hmm. Joo Hyun Park, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much.
Mm-hmm. Rania, sorry, you look like you wanted to say something. I didn't want to cut you off.
I actually thought I was going to say something. You look like you wanted to say something. So I was like, I like that we both just mirrored each other there. That's fun. That's fun.
Yes, it is. Great minds think alike, they say.
Yeah. It's an important topic, though. Korea does not get enough attention. North Korea, I mean, it's like the only times I don't think there's in the country more demonized than North Korea.
You can literally say anything. It's actually so bad that even I saw Max Boot, I think it was, wrote an article once in the Washington, but no, Max Fisher, who is the national security correspondent there, like also like Max Boot, kind of a neocon guy. And even he wrote this long op-ed, well, it's not long, like 500 words, like, why is everyone making up things that are obviously fake about North Korea? But, you know, look, you can say anything and the demonization is high, but, you know, as former President Jimmy Carter is in hospice care, worth remembering, Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, and Donald Trump had, you know, the momentum behind negotiations that, as was just mentioned, were sabotaged by a range of reasons. So 3 very different presidents, very different policies, different decades. So it's possible it can be done. Might be some of the low-hanging fruit of foreign policy, but, you know, there has to be the political will there, which there isn't, unfortunately. But we shall see. Hopefully the tables will turn on that one. But we now want to turn our attention to the Midwest, the Windy City, I believe America's 3rd largest city, the city of Chicago, which is having mayoral elections next Tuesday. I, for one, am very interested in what's going to happen there, and we are very honored to have Jim Daly, who's the digital news editor for The Tribe, with us. I hope you're following The Tribe. That's with 2 eyes. If you aren't, you should. Mr. Daly, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Well, it's great to have you here, and, you know, I think unfortunately, many people who don't live in Chicago know Chicago primarily because of, the violence issue and everything that they see night to night. Obviously, there are many different issues, but I did want to start there because Chicago has been a city that has been very much at the forefront, especially since the Laquan McDonald killing, of this conversation around what to do about policing as well as, quote unquote crime. And I'm wondering how that conversation has been playing out so far in the context of this election, which is both mayoral and I know there are some other pieces as well.
Certainly. So it's playing out in two formats. One is in the mayoral debates, a number of candidates are running on very strict law and order platforms. The current frontrunner, according to most polls, Paul Vallis, is running with the endorsement of the Fraternal Order of Police, and he has promoted a very law and order platform. Most of the candidates who are running for mayor have come out against any idea of reducing the police budget, which is currently $1.9 billion and has increased year over year for decades. Only one activist, Jamal Green, has specifically said that he wants to defund the police, but a number of candidates, specifically Brandon Johnson, for example, have talked about redirecting funds away from just patrol and into violence prevention avenues. So that's how it's playing out in the mayoral debate. Overall, the candidates do not seem very keen to say anything against the police, to give any sort of opening to their opponents that they would be opposed to anything that would reduce public safety in the city, or sorry, opposed to anything that would increase public safety or keep it as it is. Now, that said, public safety varies ward by ward and block by block in this city. So the way that the violence plays out impacts Black and brown communities on the south and west sides far differently from more affluent communities on the city's north shore that are also whiter communities. But there has been, since the pandemic, there has been a narrative around crime in this city that is tied to actual events, and there have been more shootings in areas that are not these neighborhoods that are traditionally looked at as violence hotspots, that are the communities that have been systematically disinvested from for decades. The other way that this is playing out is that we are on the cusp of a very historic election in the city because we're electing civilians to police oversight bodies. This is something that came out of decades of organizing that most recently really got started with the 2012 murder of Rakia Boyd by off-duty CPD officer Dante Servin. That galvanized the movement to start looking for community control of the police. And this was something that organizers worked on for years, building a base in the communities and building what effectively is a mass movement in these communities. Then the murder of Laquan McDonald by a CPD officer definitely added more fuel to that. And then the crisis of the George Floyd murder and the rebellions that sparked really gave the mass movement what it needed to get this over the line. And in 2021, the city council passed an ordinance establishing 3-member councils in each of the city's 22 police districts. And then also establishing a citywide commission on public safety and accountability. This was not precisely what organizers had looked for. They had wanted direct control of the police in the hands of civilians. That's a movement that goes all the way back to the Black Panthers in this city. It was started by Chairman Fred Hampton and the Panthers in the 1960s. Chairman Fred, of course, was assassinated by the Chicago police in 1968. And since then, the movement has been moving in that direction for community control of police. This is not quite that. What the councils will be able to do is make recommendations to police commanders in each district. They will be able to recommend people for the citywide community commission on public safety and accountability. That commission has some oversight in that it can take a vote of no confidence in the police superintendent if they feel that that person is not holding officers who engage in misconduct or abuse accountable. They also can hire and fire the chief administrator of the Civilian Office of Police Accountability. which is an office that investigates misconduct complaints and is independent from the department. But overall, it is a step towards greater reform and greater oversight of the police.
I'm curious just to go back in time for a moment, because Chicago has been what's the opposite of blessed? Cursed. Has been cursed with some really awful mayors in the past. And one of those mayors was Rahm Emanuel, who was the former, I believe he was the chief of staff of Barack Obama before he became mayor of Chicago. And under his administration, he shut down something like 50 schools in Chicago.
Yes.
And almost, I think every single one of them was in a majority poor Black neighborhood. And also he was heavily involved in covering or trying to cover up the police killing of Laquan McDonald. So I'm just curious, if you can just talk a bit about the sort of legacy of that particular administration, or is it just every administration? I'm not sure. But Rahm Emanuel seems like an important figure in this moving forward and what's going on in Chicago now.
Certainly, I think you raise a good point. And also, we would be remiss if we didn't mention the administration that preceded Rahm Emanuel, which was Mayor Richard M. Daley, who made his bones politically in the state's attorney's office, prosecuting cases that were brought by the midnight crew of John Burge, who was a commander who notoriously tortured hundreds of Black men into false confessions. And so that's what preceded Rahm. Rahm, in his tenure, like you said, he closed 50 schools. 50 public schools in Black and brown neighborhoods. He also he led the initiative to establish a police academy on the west side. This is a multi-million dollar investment in a training site for cops that is in one of the poorer neighborhoods in Chicago. It's located in Humboldt Park, which is currently a gentrifying neighborhood, but has traditionally been a working class, largely Puerto Rican neighborhood. And the Cop Academy they just opened it a few months ago. Finally, they broke ground on it years ago, built it. It includes a fake city block of 3 flats and apartment buildings and things like this. It's very involved. It was a huge investment. And Rahm Emanuel also, you're right, part of the reason that he likely did not seek a third term for office was because the murder of Laquan McDonald happened under his watch. He did not publicly acknowledge it or release the videotape of it until a judge ordered that. And conveniently, that all came out after he was elected to his second term. And so absolutely, he plays a part in as mayor, as every mayor has, in how the Chicago Police Department has police brutally and ineffectively as well. They have a abysmally low clearance rate, and are known for misconduct and abuse.
Mm-hmm. That's certainly the case. Looking at, I think Chicago, like many other major cities in America, is I don't want to say bedeviled, but if you do anything against rich people, they're going to leave the city, then the city is going to collapse. And I think this is a very familiar conversation to a number of people in major cities around the country. And I wonder how it's playing out in the context of this race.
I mean, this has certainly been a focal part of the race. Any candidate who mentions that they want to tax rich people that's extended to say that they're taxing the entire middle class and that, we'll lose our tax base. And I think that's simply not true. Like Chicago has relatively high taxes already, but by virtue of the fact that we are the 3rd largest city, we're the largest city in the Great Lakes. We are a hub for culture and business, whatever you want to look at. People aren't going to leave Chicago for that. At the same time, Black people have been leaving Chicago for decades. And these are Black middle class people who are being driven out of the city by the fact that it will not do anything to stop the violence in Black communities. It divests from Black communities. It has done so for decades, and is not a welcoming place for many Black and brown people. I think this plays out in gentrification. I mentioned Humboldt Park previously. Humboldt Park became the Puerto Rican hub of the city after, in the 1960s and 70s, the Puerto Rican community in Lincoln Park, which is closer to the lake, it's further east from Humboldt Park, they were pushed west very deliberately. And a cultural mecca for Puerto Rican people. There's a Puerto Rican Cultural Center. You may have seen pictures of the iconic Puerto Rican flags on Division Street that mark this area. And probably about 15 years ago, gentrification found this neighborhood, and it has been gentrifying since. So I think in the mayoral race and in a lot of political discussions, the question comes down to who does the city serve? Who is it for? Is it for the business class of the Loop? Is it for affluent white people on the North Shore? Is it for Black and brown people and working class white people in the neighborhoods? I think that you have a divide between the mayoral candidates, and also you have a divide between the mayoral candidates on that issue. And also, more so, there is a divide in this race generally between, I think, what could be termed more reactionary elements and elements that are more progressive. And this plays out most in the fact that the Chicago Teachers Union has put a lot of effort into this race. So they are supporting Brandon Johnson. He's a former CTU organizer. Put a lot of money into backing him and backing other socially progressive candidates because under Karen Lewis, who was previous president of the CTU, the union moved away from solely being a member services union and into more of a political entity that is driving social justice causes citywide. And it's because they see those causes as linked to the welfare of their students and their teachers. On the flip side of that, the Fraternal Order of Police has backed quite a few candidates. It's backed aldermanic candidates. That's what we poured money into city council races. It has poured money into these police district council races. So here we have a reactionary union. They're famous for, at least in Chicago, I don't know if they have the reputation nationwide, but their president, John Catanzara, is a vocal Trump supporter. He defended the January 6th what do you call them? With the rioters, yeah. the insurrectionists. Excuse me. He defended the January 6th insurrectionists, right? So and they have endorsed Paul Vallis, who's this law and order candidate. They've endorsed a number of candidates for the police district councils and spent at least $25,000 just on those races alone for the future of Chicago. And between the police district councils, the mayoral race, and the fact that a significant portion of the city council is not seeking re-election, so we'll have a new city council, these forces, whether we're moving in the direction of social justice and greater reforms that support the people, or this sort of reactionary police state, if I dare say, call it that, that's what the future of Chicago hangs in the balance in this election.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, there's quite a bit there. And before we let you go, just let folks know where they can find the work you all are doing in the tribe, which, of course, goes well beyond the elections and is covering, so much of the fantastic things, especially in Black Chicago.
We are. And this is a Black-owned part of a Black Chicago away from like constant drumbeat of violence and uplifting the people. So you can find us at The Tribe. That's TheTriibe.com. We're also on all of the social media. We have an excellent social media team. You can follow all of their productions there as well. So thetribe.com.
Oh, perfect. Thetribe.com. We got it up there on the bottom. Check it out. I'm reading it on a regular basis. Thanks for all your work, Jim Daly, digital news editor for The Tribe. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, y'all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is actually one of my favorite news sites in the country, to be honest with you. I mean, it's Chicago specific, but they do a great job. If you hear the nonsense on Fox News or wherever about Chicago, you need to be following The Tribe, talking directly to the people in the neighborhoods, as they say. We want to now turn our attention to the topic of the week. That is tomorrow's anniversary, 1 year anniversary of the start of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And to start us off on that note, we are honored, as we always are, to be joined here by Mr. Vijay Prashad, who is the executive director of the Tri-Continental Institute. Dr. Prashad, thank you so much for being with us. Oh, you're muted.
Muted. We just can't. I mean,
you're 100% muted, but I feel like you had to have said something good.
No. It's nice to be with you. It's nice to be with you.
I don't believe
that's what he was saying.
Do you?
I'm getting older.
Do you buy that? Do you buy that's what he was saying?
Well, we're all getting older. That's the good thing. We're all in it together. But this global
is it a good
conflict,
thing?
another thing we're all not by our own will in together here. We're 1 year on. I guess maybe rather than editorialize, Vijay, I'm just curious, what are some of your reflections going into tomorrow's 1 year anniversary?
Well, it's an interesting anniversary because the anniversary itself is filled with debate about what's going on. It's not like something quite straightforward. Something that was a destruction, an earthquake in Syria and in Turkey and so on. Here, how one even talks about what happened last year in February and when that conflict begins and who are the players in that conflict, all of that is up for grabs. Is this a Russian invasion of Ukraine? Is this a contest between NATO and Russia? Where is China in this? Is this a war? As we speak, the G20 countries are gathering in Bangalore in southern India. And that's one of the issues that they've already dealt with on the first day of the G20 meeting. United States trying to say it's a war. This is for the final communique. On day one, they start to draft the communique. United States saying it's a war. India, which is the chair of the G20 right now, is pushing back and saying, no, we don't want to use the word war. We're going to call it a crisis. The crisis in Ukraine, the crisis or the challenge. These are the two words they are using, crisis and challenge. In fact, Eugene, you started off by saying conflict in Ukraine. Conflict is somewhere in between war and crisis. Crisis is an extremely generic way of talking about what has happened this year in Ukraine. So it's very hard to even understand how to talk about the 1 year anniversary, because how you talk about what's happening is already got inside it your opinion about what's going on in this war. And there's so much quote unquote information war happening that words seem to matter in this conflict, war, much more than in any other conflict, crisis, war that I've ever followed before in my life.
There's so many different aspects of this war. There's the way that it's revealed how, Europe really doesn't have any sort of independent policies of its own. It's really a subject of the Americans on so many levels. It's also demonstrated that, the U.S. is looking at this as a sort of kind of practice round against China, right? We've heard a lot of U.S. officials talking about how Ukraine they want to use the Ukraine playbook with Taiwan. And then there's also the stakes. That's what I want to ask you about. I want to ask you about the stakes because the stakes of the war seem to keep growing. The escalation, there's almost no means of diplomacy anymore. You have almost no arms treaties left between the U.S. and Russia at this point. You have this explosive story out from Seymour Hersh a couple weeks ago about how the U.S. Covertly blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, attacked the infrastructure of its ally Germany, and what can only be considered an act of terrorism. I mean, the sort of going up the escalation ladder hasn't stopped since last year, and it seems like on all sides, particularly on the NATO side, that there's even more resolve to continue to sacrifice Ukrainians at the altar of weakening Russia. And of course, that leaves us with the whole threat of potential nuclear warfare. So I'm curious if you could talk a bit about the seriousness of the stakes of this war, because I don't feel as though that gets talked about enough, particularly in the mainstream.
Well, it is deeply chilling. I mean, look, I was very interested that the Chinese foreign minister went to Munich at the security conference, and he said, now Ukraine, tomorrow Taiwan. He said, is this the road you're taking? And he and Wang Yi, who's the highest Chinese diplomatic official, were asking questions in Munich, which I found quite interesting. What were they asking? They were asking the United States elites, effectively, perhaps the European elites, how far are you willing to go? Are you going to go all the way on this? Are you going to launch nuclear weapons and so on? What's the game plan here? What's up with you guys? And actually, I would say that that's a really good discussion for people to have. What is the US elite up to here? What do they want? Do they want the dismemberment of Russia, the collapse of the current governing structure? Let me tell you something. My generation, in the 1990s, my generation in Russia, people who are now in their 50s and 60s, experienced a regime change already. They saw the catastrophic decline in the living standards and so on. People in my generation who are now in positions of some authority in Russia, they simply don't want to see a repeat of that twice in the lifetimes of people. They just don't want to see that again. Whatever their opinion of Mr. Putin, whatever their opinion of the conflict in Ukraine, they're simply not interested in revisiting the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the same way as during the Arab Spring, people used to ask, why aren't the Algerians rising up? Well, because the Algerians fought a decade long catastrophic civil war. And I remember being in Algiers, being in Oran, asking people, why isn't there, the kind of copycat phenomena of the Arab Spring? And they said, we are exhausted by this stuff. People tried to come after the what is known in Algeria as the power, and then said, look, it's just not going to happen like this. We're not going to go out on the street and see our young killed again. This sense of civilizational exhaustion is not being taken seriously. In the same way, in China, there's a high level of support of the government for all kinds of reasons, perhaps positive reasons. But one of them is that people have looked carefully at what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed, and they don't want to repeat that in China. So the question to ask of the US elites, what's your game plan? Do you really think you're going to be able to dismember Russia? There's no appetite in Russia for it. You're going to have to impose this with force. What kind of force will you use? Are you going to go nuclear, as it were? And now, Mr. Putin has withdrawn Russia from the New START treaty. That was to have expired in 2026. There's some chatter about how, well, Russia is withdrawing from treaties. Let me remind people, and I think, Rania, you already indicated that United States unilaterally withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty in 2002. That was George W. Bush. United States unilaterally withdrew from the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, the INF Treaty 2019. That was Donald Trump. That wasn't Putin. Putin has merely come in on a third run and said, well, you guys are not interested in discussing a architecture for nuclear, as it were, management. We're out of here. We're gone. New START is finished. I was chilled by the departure from New START because now there are no hotlines anymore. There's no red phone between the two important countries, And I think that's the reason why the Chinese came to Munich, why Wang Yi went to Russia, why they're trying to tell Blinken and Biden and others, listen, guys, you got to grow up here. There are serious matters at stake. And the Chinese have launched a global security initiative this week around those issues. It's not just China. It's India, it's Indonesia, it's Mexico, it's South Africa, range of developing countries extraordinarily worried about all this. I was very interested at Munich to listen to the Prime Minister of Namibia. Her name is Sarah Kungonelwa Amadila. And she said something interesting. She first cautioned that this war was going out of hand. And then she said, this is the Prime Minister of Namibia, the bottom line is that money used to buy weapons would be better used to promote development in Ukraine, in Africa, in Asia, in the European Union itself, where many people are facing hardships. That's the attitude of the majority of people in the world. It's well worth your listeners knowing that you add up the total population of North America, Canada and the United States, leave out Mexico, Canada, the United States and Europe, you'll struggle to reach 1 billion people. There are 7 billion people on the planet. 1 billion people don't constitute the international community. And in that 1 billion people, there's a lot of disagreement with what their governments are doing. So they don't even speak for 1 billion people in a planet of 7 billion. And that's why they're having a great deal of difficulty in the G20. And that's the reason why Emmanuel Macron in Munich said that the West has lost credibility in the global South. Very strong statement from Emmanuel Macron.
I think you raise a good point, and I mean, it's one of these questions that I think is very much hanging over geopolitics. Is all of these different sort of Western architectures, the G20. I mean, I took Yellen's pushing at the finance ministers meeting around Ukraine to be sort of bullying of India. We saw last year Indonesia was the president of the G20, same thing, constant bullying them to take a particular position, to ban Russia, to invite Zelensky, so on and so forth. Next two presidents of the G20 are Brazil and South Africa, maybe in the reverse order. But I just maybe am wondering your thoughts about some of these changes we're seeing go through them, because obviously the G20 was not set up to be a forum for the global South to have a platform, but to, include a handful more countries into the Western club.
Well, look, the G20 was created, Eugene, just to remind us to provide liquidity in the Western financial institutions, because in 2007, China and India were running surpluses, and the Western countries went begging to Indonesia, India, China, and other countries and said, put some of your money into our banking system because our banking system is insolvent. And in fact, Sarkozy said, we're going to shut down the G7 and the G20 will be the new executive of the world. Well, they created the G20, they maintained the G7. Now, Janet Yellen came in and started pushing people around and saying, hello, listen, got to increase sanctions on Russia. I was very interested in the response from several of the countries. The first interesting response was they basically went to rule. They said, look, this is not the Security Council, Ms. Yellen. This is a body to deal with economic issues. We deal with trade issues, with financial management of the world order. So they basically came to rule. They said, no, wait, you're in the wrong forum. You want to talk about sanctions? Go to the UN Security Council. This is not where we talk about sanctions. This is where we talk about economic growth, where we talk about the fact that the total global debt overhang is $65 trillion. I mean, this is where we deal with that. This is where we deal with declining growth rates. I thought that was a very interesting and studious response to Janet Yellen. It also shows the desperation of the United States, which is using every and any forum to try to browbeat countries of the global South. For instance, the US-Africa summit held in December in Washington, D.C. was a way to get African countries to basically come on side. And guess what? Here's the Namibian Prime Minister in Munich saying, sorry, pals, I'm not with you. The attempt to get countries around the world to send arms to Ukraine, the full court press trying to get Brazil to send arms to Ukraine, and the Brazilians saying, listen, this is not what we buy arms for. It's not to transship them to Ukraine. And by the way, the reason I slipped and said Israel is because the United States had Israel send a lot of the warehoused equipment to Ukraine, the kind of stuff that was rotting in an Israeli warehouse, in order for the West to say, look, we're arming the Ukrainians. I mean, there's got to be a little bit of you got to understand that they're also putting out their used surplus on the Ukrainians and, jetting up their own engines to get new supplies for themselves. This is not all humanitarian. The US is ordering a lot of stuff for itself. Anyway, the point is that the US is desperate, going to every single forum, trying to get people to, arm twist countries to condemn Russia, to bring Ukraine into the fold and so on. These countries are just not going to do it. I mean, look in India, for instance, the big top elites, the Ambanis, the Adanis, and so on, they are buying coal from Russia. They are buying energy. The Indian public sector energy company, ONGC, Oil and Natural Gas Corporation, is buying assets that the Europeans and the Americans are vacating in Russia. The business opportunities with the Russians are also attractive. It's not just this. And also something that I want to put on the table here is there is a growing, and I don't know what kind of adjective to use for this, but there's a growing sentiment among the middle class in countries like India, Indonesia, Mexico, Brazil, and so on, which is quote unquote anti-colonial. It's a terrible, it's not really anti-colonial, it's not radical, but they just now are at the point in world history where some middle class person in India is saying, I don't want to be pushed around by Janet Yellen. We have our own destiny, we have our own national interests and so on. And in a way, the Yanks are having a hard time coming to terms with the fact that this middle class, which had been groveling in the early decades of globalization, is now finally standing up and saying, hey, listen, if we want to eat something, we're going to eat it. We want to smoke in our houses, we're going to do that. There's a kind of middle class arrival in these countries, which I think is a surprise to the United States.
Indeed. Well, I also am curious, what do you think that signifies in the sense of US waning power? Because you do have all of these countries, and we're not talking about here like just Venezuela and Cuba and, Syria and the countries, Iran, that obviously the US is already at some kind of level of warfare with, and our adversary countries that automatically are willing to stand up to the US. We're talking about countries like you mentioned, India and India's middle class. I mean, India is refusing to join in on US sanctions, right? You have countries across Africa, a humongous continent, refusing to join in on US sanctions. Also, Latin America not only refuses to join in on US sanctions, but countries in Latin America are refusing, like you mentioned, Brazil, refusing to send weapons. What does that say about US power around the world? And I'm sorry to say that with a smile on my face. I'm a little overly optimistic, but
I think it's perfectly acceptable to smile with that, but at the same time, I think we need to be sober about what's happening, because while this is happening in Bangalore, where the Indian government is saying, look, we're not interested in hard language against Russia in this document, India is sniffing around, wondering if it should join or become part of what's known as NATO plus. This is on the table. It's very much there. On the African continent, yes, you got countries saying, look, we think focus on Ukraine is unfortunate. We have our own problems and so on. At the same time, the government of Ghana welcomes the United States and gives them access to a terminal in the airport. And in fact, US military presence on the African continent is increasing. There's a liaison office of the US Defense Department inside the African Union building in Addis Ababa. So these things are very complicated, and it's not linear. At the same time as you've got this middle class saying, hey, listen, I'm fed up with being told what to do, they're also saying, oh, well, it's a US military coming in. Maybe we'll gain something. There'll be some contracts and whatever. I mean, don't forget that when the Chinese come into countries, they make contracts with local providers to build roads or build a hospital or whatever it is. The US also shows up. They don't contract to build hospitals. They contract to build runways, to build a base, to go and work on their base and so on. They're also producing investment. It's merely military investment. But don't underestimate the power of that. I mean, the French are being booted out of the Sahel region, out of Burkina Faso, out of Mali, and so on. But the US base in Niger, in Agadez, Niger, is still as big as it was, the largest drone base in the world. We are in the period of contradiction. This is the interregnum between two periods. We just don't know how long this interregnum is going to last. But I think we have got to watch very carefully what's going on. Is the Indian government sincerely opposed to the US footprint on the world? Or is it merely opposed to what the United States is doing with Russia? In other words, if tomorrow the US ramps up the pressure on China, will India, and this government in particular, which has problems with China in general, will India then say, no, we also want to join even deeper the squeeze on China? I don't think this is necessarily some kind of principled break with either globalization or with US imperialism. I think we're in a period where we're seeing a lot of pragmatic and practical decisions being made by these countries like Indonesia, India, also Mexico. I mean, I don't know if Mexico's rebellion against US foreign policy led by Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, I don't know if this rebellion by AMLO is in fact going to be deeper than his period in office. What happens when the next Mexican president comes? Will that president maintain Mexico's rebellion against US foreign policy in Latin America? Right now, Mexico, in fact, is leading the rebellion against US foreign policy in Latin America. Mexico is the leading country saying we're going to, lead a global rebellion against the blockade of Cuba. Will this remain beyond AMLO? I think we've got to understand this is a period of practical decision making, pragmatic jockeying. I don't think there's a principled break with US power as yet.
Well, the good news is we have the newsletters and dossiers from the Tricontinental Institute to help us sort through all of this. Vijay Prashad, Executive Director of the Tricontinental Institute, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks a lot.
Yep, Tricontinental required reading, as it were. Well, Rania, we want to stick for a little bit here on some of these issues around, tomorrow's anniversary, the 1-year anniversary of the Russia-Ukraine war. Sorry for the redundancy there, but you had actually brought up to me earlier this week this issue of John Kirby and I think Matt Lee from the AP getting into it over Ukraine. I don't know the exact context of it. Maybe you want to give it. I know we have the video, but maybe explain to people what it is.
Well, basically, Matt Lee, which is like this, I believe he's for the AP, right?
Yep.
He has this reputation for when he's in the, he's usually in the State Department pool. This might be the Pentagon pool. I forget which one John Kirby's the spokesperson for.
National
all of
Security
these different
Council.
No, thank you. All of these different spokespeople just blend together as like one.
They all often appear at the State Department too.
Yeah.
It's like, anyway.
That's
but,
true. It's like, which one of you? Anyway, so it's not Ned Price. It's the other guy, John Kirby. The point is, Matt Lee basically raises the question about, well, who's really provoking who? Because you've surrounded Russia with NATO bases. And John Kirby, I mean, you can tell that no reporters ever ask this. No reporters ever bring this up because that's just not what most people in the corporate mainstream media do. There's black and white. Russia is just a crazy country led by a crazy man who decided he woke up one morning because he hates Ukraine so much. He decided to invade Ukraine because he's just a wild Hitlerian type figure. But there's more to it than that. And this is one of those rare instances where somebody who is in the room, inside the room, where it happens, so to speak, actually raised that issue. So let's see what happens.
To look at this and say the reason that the Russian army is on NATO, the Russian army is at NATO's doorstep is because NATO has expanded rather than the Russians expanding. That, in other words, NATO has moved closer to Russia rather than Russia moving closer to NATO. Is that not an accurate way to look at this?
I think that's the way President Putin probably looks at it. It's certainly not the way that we look at it.
You don't think that NATO has expanded eastward toward Russia?
NATO has expanded,
Okay.
and the expansion has been a good thing for.
So the reason that the Russian army is at NATO's doorstep is not the fault of the Russian army, it's not the Russian army that's done it. It's NATO has moved closer to moved
I'm pretty
east.
sure it wasn't NATO who was ordering, upwards of 15 battalion tactical groups to within 10 kilometers of the border with Ukraine, and I'm pretty sure it wasn't NATO who put little green men inside Ukraine to destabilize eastern
I'm
cities.
pretty sure that Ukraine is not a member of NATO. So unless that's changed,
It's not
Okay.
changed, but I'm
So,
pretty sure the movement by Russia is Russia's decision.
if NATO has moved east, the reason that the Russian army is closer or on NATO's doorstep is because NATO moved, not
NATO
because
is not an anti-Russia alliance. NATO is a security alliance.
for 50 years it was an anti-Soviet alliance. So
Where's
do you
the
not
Soviet
understand
Union
it? So do you not understand how, or can you not even see how the Russians will perceive it as a threat? And the fact that it keeps getting closer to their border while their troops, I mean, the places where their troops are, you say their troops are, and may have been in Ukraine and Georgia, are not NATO members.
I'm not going to pretend to know what goes in President Putin's mind or Russian military commanders. I mean, I barely got a history degree at the University of South Florida. What I can tell you is that NATO is a defensive alliance. It remains a defensive
Fair
alliance.
enough, but it has moved east, correct? I mean, that's just a
It
fact.
has expanded, absolutely.
Right, exactly.
But
And so
there's
the
no reason
reason-
for anybody to think the expansion is a hostile or threatening move. And we've been saying that throughout the last 15 years, Matt.
It's like you're moving closer to Russia. You're blaming the Russians for being close to NATO.
No.
That's exactly what Hegel
What we're
said.
blaming the Russians for violating the territorial integrity of Ukraine and destabilizing the security
which is
situation
not a
inside
NATO
Europe.
member. Which is not a NATO member.
I see to you
Other
on that
countries
point.
feel threatened.
I like how that other reporter at the end had to chime in there, but other countries feel threatened. She's like,
Yeah.
let me help you, John Kirby. Let me
know.
help you.
Amazing. One time in the mid-1990s, President Bill Clinton actually said to his own officials whether or not they should be more forthcoming with the Russians because they were lying to them about the intentions of NATO moving eastward. And of course, they did not become more forthcoming. And, that's all laid out in an article I put on liberationnews.org called Is NATO to Blame? That is NATO to blame. Check that out, liberationnews.org. But it's amazing the over a decade worth of assurances that NATO was not going to continue to move eastward. The massive warnings they had as early as 1994. Actually, I take that back, as early as 1989, that doing this would lead to exactly what's happening right now. Nonetheless, that was not heeded. But here we are yet again on the cusp. But, there's a couple things I just want to get to here before we move to our next guest that I think are important. One is the overall cost. And I know we have some graphs here, and shout out to Andrew from our team. The overall cost of what the U.S. has spent in Ukraine. I want to see if we can bring that up. I mean, it really is an enormous number when you look at it here. I think it's $113 billion, if I'm not mistaken. $113 billion. Oof. Yes, here it is. That's 46 billion. That's the amount of money they've spent on non-military needs. $46 billion. That's like even firefighting in Ukraine. There's schools, all these other things that can't get money in the United States, of course. And that's 62 billion that you have there, which is what they spent on weapons and military related things, which is crazy. I mean, by comparison, to fix all of the backlog of repairs in America's public housing would be $70 billion. The U.S. government had the opportunity to do that 2 years ago with the Build Back Better plan, and they rejected it. But there you go right there, $113 billion.
Crazy.
That's a huge amount of money. And that's in 1 year, actually less than a year, not a year until tomorrow, $113 billion. And, they make you think it's just weapons, but I'm telling you, like, almost everything in Ukraine is now running off this money from the U.S. and the EU. It's going in so quickly. So it's obviously there's a huge amount of corruption.
Well, yeah, I mean, you had, I think, Transparency International, which is like a very well-known Western organization. It's not like some Russian organization that came up with this, actually labeled Ukraine the most corrupt country in Europe prior to this invasion. Yeah. So you better bet that for a fact that there's portions of that money that's going right into the bank accounts of a bunch of Ukrainian oligarchs.
Yeah, no, it's true. Well, one thing about this is relevant, though, and I think we might have this polling is how Americans are feeling about this, and the number of people who think we should send weapons to Ukraine, as of an AP poll from, I believe, the middle of last month, the middle of January, it's 48%. That bottom number is 66%, which is where it was in the middle of 2022, basically. So essentially from like the summer of last year to today, 20 some odd percentage point drop in the number of Americans who think that weapons should be sent to Ukraine. Now 48%, below 50%, less than half the people in the United States think that this endless, pit of weapons, $62 billion worth of weapons, $113 billion worth of money overall, should continue to take place. And I think that's pretty notable, Rania, because certainly half of Congress is not saying this. No. The president can't be cut in half, but half of Biden isn't saying this. I mean, the political representatives, all you have is a handful of, idiots around the edges like Marjorie Taylor Greene who say take the money from Ukraine and go kill people on the border who come from non-white European countries. That's the best you can get inside the halls of power. And I'd say that's pretty bad. But I do think it's notable that despite, and I'm curious your thoughts about this before we go to our next guest quickly, the very fact that despite this huge amount of propaganda that has gone into this issue, that quite frankly, when you start to look month by month as the conflict goes on, more and more people in the U.S. are starting to say, like, what is this for? What are we doing? What's the end game? Why are we doing this? I mean, it's quite astonishing that 1 year in, really in many ways, the rationale that's being pushed by the NATO countries is starting to collapse on its own weight.
Yeah, because I think a lot of these populations in these countries, when it comes down to it, there's only so long that that they're going to care. First of all, people have their own lives to be concerned about. You have things are expensive. You have so many problems in the United States. You have problems in European countries as well. And the threat of more problems if this war continues, gas shortages in Europe. And in the case of the US, I think it says a lot that Joe Biden went to Kiev to do this, theatrical performance, really. I mean, he got, acted like he was being so brave, but obviously, he got the okay and the agreement from the Russians that they wouldn't harm him while he was there.
100%.
So there was a security arrangement, obviously, that took place there. But he went to Kiev And he hasn't gone to East Palestine, for example, in Ohio, where, as we covered last week, the train derailment that has left this like horrible toxic pollution in that town. And of course, Trump took full advantage of that and went to East Palestine. Well, Joe Biden hasn't bothered. And it does say a lot about what matters to people. And again, there's only so long that you can get people invested in a country that's very far away. They can't find it on a map. And, you can scream about freedom and democracy all you want, but at some point that gets stale. And at some point it becomes an issue of, wait a second, like there's a huge contradiction here. Why are you unable to do anything about my student loan debt, but you can keep giving billions of dollars to Ukraine? Like, how come you can't do anything about the cost of my prescription drugs, but you can keep sending all this money to Ukraine? Like, how come my kid's school is underfunded and like there's, a million kids in each class and there's like a shortage of teachers, but you keep giving all this money to Ukraine? I mean, at some point, those questions come to the fore. And so I don't think it's sustainable. At least not the way it's happening right now, where there's constant like PR and announcements about giving more money to Ukraine, because eventually people are going to be like, enough.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, even one of the biggest war hawks, Michael McFaul, is out on his Substack today saying, eventually peace is going to come. How do we prepare? Now, of course, many of the things he's saying are completely ridiculous. But, now even though the most warlike of warlike people, I think, are recognizing if you don't shift the messaging a little bit towards at least being open to the idea of peace talks, people will more rapidly abandon you. And allegedly, the U.S. has been pressuring Zelensky. That's why he issued that 10-point peace plan a couple months back, to show that he was open to negotiations, so the American public, as it were, would not be as skeptical of, what's going on there. But I agree with you. It's going to be interesting to see how that continues to play out. But we want to switch gears here slightly, and that's to the issue of China and Taiwan. I mean, obviously, this has become sort of an interesting subtext here. But before I get into that, let's just bring in our next guest we have here today, Dr. Ken Hammond, who's a professor of East Asian and Global History at New Mexico State University. Ken, thanks so much for being back with us.
Glad to be here.
Well, we are happy to have you. And, it's interesting that a sort of subtext that the U.S. is now using in Ukraine is how this is actually sort of the dress rehearsal for China invading Taiwan. I even, read an article in Politico the other day where Senator Chris Coons said that the very close ally of Biden, for those who don't know, that Biden's whole strategy towards Russia is to help Ukraine as much as you can without degrading U.S. ability to respond to other crises like China invading Taiwan. And the reason I want to tee it up like that is it's almost now being talked about as a fait accompli in much of the Western media, not if, but like when is China going to do this military invasion of Taiwan? And it just feels like, beyond everything else, that in and of itself is sort of an amazing point, that despite of expressing no desire to invade Taiwan, China is widely being tipped to do so any day now.
Well, yes, I think that it's pretty clear that the narrative that has been coming out of Washington and being spread by the corporate media in the United States is exactly that we face an imminent crisis that has been entirely generated by China. China's disrupting this peaceful world order that the United States has been guaranteeing, our nice rules-based order, and nasty China has come along and is the major threat now. This has been articulated in defense documents, in security policy, over and over again, and our politicians spout this rhetoric every day, and it's repeated in the mainstream corporate media. Even though, as you say, China's position is and has always been that the status of Taiwan is it's a domestic question. It's a question amongst the Chinese people on both sides of the strait that they will resolve in their own way, in their own time, without any need for outside interference. And the United States, of course, the official position of the American government, which President Biden rather, duplicitously restated recently when he talked with Xi Jinping, is that the United States acknowledges the one China policy. There is only one China. Taiwan is a part of China. That is the official commitment of the United States government. And yet American politicians and the rhetoric of President Biden himself is constantly undermining that, constantly violating the terms of that policy and the terms of the communiques and the agreements that both governments have agreed to, have signed on over the years. But this mythology, this narrative of China as the aggressor, China as the hostile power, if you repeat that often enough, it just becomes the conventional wisdom. And that's what they want. They want to put the American people in a state of mind which says China is our enemy. We need to be afraid of China, rather than, China's trying to deal with this issue of their own. And really, shouldn't we be trying to find ways to solve things like global warming and global economic inequities and, challenges for development? Wouldn't it be nice if we could work together and solve those kind of things? But as long as China can be portrayed as our enemy, as the aggressor, as the attacker, then, it lets America off the hook, American elites off the hook for trying to solve problems that are really an existential challenge for the American people themselves.
Yeah, it's also the issue of, the U.S. constantly making this comparison between Ukraine and Taiwan suggests that China has any interest in even invading Taiwan, which China has repeatedly has said it doesn't. But the U.S. is constantly trying to provoke. What is the danger there? I don't foresee a future where China would actually invade Taiwan. Unless its security was somehow incredibly threatened. But what is the potential danger here if the U.S. continues to escalate over this issue?
Well, the danger is pretty straightforward in that what American actions and many American words are designed to do is to frustrate China, to provoke China. It's like you're poking them in the eye or going up to somebody and poking them in the chest and challenging them over and over and over again in the hopes that they'll take the first swing. And then, of course, then you can say, well, look, they're the aggressors. All we're doing, and this is the line that we just heard about Ukraine, all we're doing is being defensive. We're just protecting ourselves. So the goal is to provoke China. And I have to say that China has been remarkably restrained. The response to provocations, perhaps most dramatically when Speaker Pelosi went to Taiwan last year, and although China, made some gestures with its military, it didn't do anything that was actually threatening to Taiwan. Their rhetoric has been very calm and very practical, and they have reiterated over and over again their longstanding commitment to the peaceful resolution of this question. It should be solved through dialogue and discussion and negotiation and all this between the local authorities on Taiwan and the central government in Beijing. And there are many people on Taiwan. We've seen a lot of action recently with delegations from the mainland coming to Taiwan, meeting with Kuomintang officials and others in local governments. The people on Little Jinmen Island, which is part of the Taiwanese local authorities, controlled by them, they've declared themselves to be a peace zone because they're a mile off the Chinese coast. They have interactions all the time. They know China's not a threat. So it's the American politicians who are ramping this up. And the danger is that they'll be successful in somehow triggering an incident, which can then be parlayed into a broader conflict. They seem to think, irrationally enough, that provoking conflict with China, even to the point of war, would be a desirable outcome for America. And clearly it would not. But they're playing a very, very dangerous game. And largely for domestic consumption and their own political ambitions, but it's super dangerous.
No, and I think you make an extraordinarily good point there about Taiwan. I know the Kuomintang leadership just came back from a 9-day trip there in the mainland, and in a poll that just came out a couple days ago, topped the ruling party, and in the last local elections did quite well. And I mean, that seems like an interesting factor that as the U.S. seems to have ramped up its sort of war preparations, the people of Taiwan sort of responding back in their own way to sort of say, whoa, wait a second, we're not 100% sure what we feel about that. But I guess in a way, I'm curious your thoughts about why this is such an existential question to the United States, because obviously the issue of Taiwan is a deep issue for China itself. It's a part of China divided based on the politics of the country there at the end of the Civil War. But for America, I think for a lot of people, myself included, sometimes you wonder, why is specifically this such a key issue for U.S. imperialism to potentially risk nuclear war over?
Well, I think it's a critical issue for American imperialism precisely because it is such a fundamental concern of China. It's Taiwan is part of China. Historically, for hundreds of years, Taiwan has been part of China, and the only reason that there is a local authority on Taiwan today, which is not normally integrated with the government of the rest of the country, is because of the interposition of the American Navy after the victory of the Revolution. And back in 1949, 1950, the U.S. Navy put itself in the strait to protect the remnants of the nationalist regime on the mainland who had fled there, had massacred thousands of local Taiwanese people in order to control them because they didn't want them coming there, but they took over the island. They've remained there ever since. They held it under martial law for over 50 years. And, it's just been a thorn in the side of the authorities on the mainland, but it's been an outpost of American imperialism. And now, as China is prospering, is growing, is enhancing the livelihoods of its people, it's emerging once again as a significant participant in global affairs. The American elites, they see that as an existential threat for themselves. They see themselves losing the power, the privileges they've enjoyed, certainly since World War II. That's a threat to them. They see that or they feel that certainly. And so anything they can do that would provoke China. Certainly, Taiwan is not the only thing they're doing. The South China Sea, the support for insurrectionary activities in Hong Kong, the efforts to demonize China in various ways. All of these things are part of a comprehensive strategy to try to thwart China's development, stall China's reemergence as a force in world affairs, in order to preserve the hegemony, the dominance of the United States in the global system. And that's a fool's errand because these are deep structural changes taking place in the world that they're not going to stop. And all it does is alienate people in China. All it does is drive a wedge between Americans and Chinese. And, it's just not something that's gonna work to the benefit of people anywhere. Especially in the long run, the American people themselves.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Ken Hammond, as always, it's great to have you here. Very generous with your time with us at Breakthrough News, and thanks for helping us sort through it all once again.
Glad to be here, Rania, Eugene. Good to see you guys. Take care.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dispatches with Rania Khalek, the Socialist Program with Brian Becker here on Breakthrough News. We've had a lot of great segments with Ken, which I, encourage you to go back into our archives there on YouTube and check out. It's Breakthrough News on YouTube. Good time since you're watching on YouTube. I guess you already know what it is. Hit subscribe and hit the bell so you can get the alerts about the things you subscribe to, including Dispatches with Rania Khalek. But Rania, as always, this brings us to the end of our show, so to speak, but a few things we always want to tell people in addition to subscribe and hit the bell.
Okay, so I just want to say before we go that I do read the comments. To those of you who are commenting, Someone did ask, do you think Rania Khalek reads these comments? And then someone replied, let's find out. Rania, if you read this, please blink. Oh my God, it worked, LOL. I actually was just blinking, but I did read your comment.
Thanks for that.
Like I wasn't blinking because of the comment. I just happened to be a blinker. My eyes aren't just constantly open, but I do read the comments. Just so you know.
We all constantly blink. But thank you, Rania.
I just thought that was funny that it was like, oh my God, she blinked. I also want to remind people that you can support our excellent work here at Breakthrough News by becoming a patron at patreon.com/breakthrough news. And should we hit that goal of 50 patrons in February, which this is our last Freedom Side in February, Eugene Puryear will what, Eugene?
I guess I'll join Instagram. I mean, so I wasn't ready for it, but Yeah.
So become a patron. So Eugene has to join Instagram. There's nothing that I enjoy more in life. Well, two things.
Yeah.
One thing is anti-imperialism. I love anti-imperialism. The second thing is getting Eugene to do things he clearly does not want to do. And he does not want to be on Instagram. So please help me be happy and get Eugene on Instagram, you guys.
Thank you. That's a great pitch. Great way to end out the month here on the Freedom Side. By the time we're back with you, it will be March, and it may be too late. So go to patreon.com/breakthrough news. Become a patron today. We're looking forward to all of your patronage. Thanks to everyone who watched. Thanks to everyone who joined. And thanks, as always, to the Breakthrough News team for putting the show together. We will see you next time.